The Young and the Restless spoilers. Nikki Newman had always believed she understood the limits of her own loyalty, that she could look Victor Newman in the eye and push back when his obsessions turned ruthless, and that she could stand beside Jack Abbott as a voice of reason whenever the Newman-Abbott feud reignited like dry brush meeting a spark. But the newest revelations from Genoa City painted a far more complicated portrait in which Nikki stood at the crossroads of a decision that could redefine decades of alliances, betrayals, and marriages. For years, she had been trapped between the man she loved and the man who had once saved her, between a marriage built on power and a friendship built on trust. And yet, for the first time, Nikki seemed ready to walk away from the expectations everyone placed on her. Her threat to leave Victor had not been an impulsive emotional outburst. It had been a warning that she was tired of carrying the weight of his vendettas. But as Christmas lights still glittered faintly around Genoa City, Victor handed her a necklace so extravagant, so dazzling, that it reminded her of all the beautiful traps he had set for her over the years. It was never just jewelry with Victor. It was a promise, a claim, a silent declaration that she belonged to him. And as the cold stones pressed against her skin, Nikki felt the familiar pull of a life she both resented and could never fully abandon. Jack Abbott, meanwhile, saw the shift in Nikki long before she admitted it to herself. He watched the way her eyes dimmed with resignation whenever Victor's name came up, how she paused before responding, how her voice lost its conviction. To Jack, the necklace was not a gift, it was a distraction, a strategic move by Victor to reclaim control. And Jack, who had spent a lifetime analyzing every Newman tactic, understood the underlying message. Victor was reasserting dominance, pulling Nikki back into his orbit before she drifted too far into Abbott territory. But what unsettled Jack most was not Victor's manipulation, it was Nikki's wavering resolve. She had fought so fiercely to convince Victor to abandon this new scheme against Jabot, to end the cycle of war that had consumed both families for generations. Yet every time Victor pushed back, Nikki softened. She begged him to be reasonable, pleaded for a ceasefire, but deep down she knew the truth Jack had long accepted. Victor Newman did not change. Not for business. Not for ego. Not even for love. This realization placed Nikki in an impossible emotional position. She had spent her entire adult life being torn between the two men, each representing a different version of herself. With Victor, she was the glamorous, powerful Newman matriarch who commanded respect simply by walking into a room. With Jack, she was the woman who could admit her flaws, confess her fears, breathe freely. Yet loyalty to either man now came with consequences so heavy that Nikki felt as though she were being crushed by invisible hands. And as the days passed, she began to question whether her insistence on peace between Victor and Jack had been naive from the start. There were some rivalries that were bred too deeply into the bone, almost genetic, and Victor's hatred of the Abbott family had never once dulled with time. If anything, age had sharpened it. The moment he spotted an Abbott across a crowded room, something dark, primal, and territorial awakened in him. Jack often joked that Victor reacted like a Rottweiler sensing a rabbit. But behind Jack's humor was decades of pain and exhaustion. Nikki could no longer deny that truth. She had begged Victor to see reason, begged him to stop this latest assault on Jabot, but the more she tried, the more rigid his stance became. And so, a dangerous thought began to whisper in the back of her mind. What if Victor isn't the one who needs convincing? What if I am? The moment she allowed herself to consider that possibility, everything shifted. She began noticing the small moments she'd ignored, how Victor's eyes narrowed whenever she defended Jack, how his voice chilled whenever she questioned his decisions, how the necklace he gave her came at the exact moment she was ready to walk out the door. Nikki wondered whether she had mistaken possession for devotion, control for love. And worst of all, she wondered whether Jack had been right all along. Because from Jack's perspective, Nikki was drifting back toward Victor's side, even if she refused to admit it. This was the pattern, the cycle that had repeated itself for decades. Nikki pulled away, Victor reeled her in, Jack braced himself for the fallout. But this time felt different, not because Victor had changed, but because Nikki had. She was tired, emotionally worn down by the years she spent mediating to men who would never coexist peacefully. She wanted calm stability and a life not dominated by corporate wars. And yet she also feared what it would mean to fully break from Victor, from the Newman empire, from the identity she had built as the woman always standing beside him, no matter how destructive his obsessions became. That fear made her hesitate, made her rationalize Victor's behavior even when she knew better, made her consider betraying Jack not out of malice but out of exhaustion. Every time she looked at the necklace, she felt the weight of his story of promises made, vows broken, and a love that had both saved and destroyed her. So when people began to whisper that Nikki might betray Xiaobo, the idea was not absurd, it was inevitable. She was being pulled back into Victor's gravitational field, and the closer she drifted, the more dangerous her position became. Jack knew the signs. He recognized the emotional retreat, the subtle distancing, the quiet apologies. He had seen it before whenever Victor tightened his grip. And now Jack, despite all his strength, felt something close to dread. He could lose Nikki again not because she chose Victor, but because she chose survival. Nikki, for her part, stood in her living room one evening, staring at her reflection, the necklace glimmering like a brand around her throat. She touched it lightly and whispered a truth she had never dared acknowledge. Maybe I was never meant to escape him. Victor Newman did not need to demand loyalty. He created conditions where loyalty became a necessity. Nikki had always been the one person who could occasionally talk him down, who could appeal to the sliver of humanity buried beneath his ego. But even she could not break the fundamental instincts encoded into him. His hatred for Jack and the Abbott family was not just long-standing, it was reflexive, visceral, an automatic response born of rivalry, competition, and decades of personal betrayal. And now Victor was engaging in yet another campaign, one he fully expected Nikki to support or at least tolerate. Her hesitation was, in his eyes, a challenge, and when Victor was challenged, he did not compromise or conquered. Between Jack's warnings, Victor's expectations, and her own fractured emotions, Nikki found herself standing on the edge of a decision that could redraw Genoa City's power map. If she sided with Victor, she would betray Jack and potentially doom Xiaobo. If she sided with Jack, she would risk dismantling her marriage and shattering the Newman dynasty. And if she tried to remain neutral, the men would simply drag her into the fight anyway. In the end, Nikki's greatest struggle was not about loyalty to a persona, it was about loyalty to herself. But after spending her life defined by two powerful men, she no longer knew which version of herself she trusted. And that, more than anything, made her dangerous. The world of Genoa City was bracing for one of its most unexpected shifts, a twist so sharp that even longtime observers of the Newman-Abbott feud felt the ground tilt beneath them. After months of watching Nikki Newman walk a treacherous tightrope between loyalty and morality, a shocking turn was quietly taking shape just beneath the surface. For weeks, Nikki had played a dangerous two-sided game, whispering caution to Victor while offering sympathy to Jack, positioning herself as the only voice capable of bridging two men locked in a decades-long war. But as the new year approached with its promise of upheaval, leaked hints began to suggest that Nikki's balancing act was coming to an end. She would choose a side, and when she did, it would not be the side anyone expected. The revelation came not from speculation or rumor, but from the lips of Josh Griffith himself. Head writer and executive producer Wo hinted in a TV Insider interview that Nikki's wavering loyalties were about to snap back into focus. With an unnerving clarity, she would swear allegiance to Victor Newman, and in doing so, redefine her relationship with Jack Abbott and his wife, Diane Jenkins Abbott. That single statement sent shockwaves through fans and characters alike because it suggested that Nikki was no longer the conflicted mediator struggling to temper Victor's ruthless impulses. Instead, she was on the verge of becoming his accomplice, willingly stepping into the shadow of his vendetta. For Jack, the possibility felt like betrayal with a familiar sting. He had counted on Nikki not for blind loyalty, but for fairness, for moral grounding, for the rare voice in Victor's chaotic orbit who dared to challenge him. Yet Griffith's comments implied that Nikki's heart had tilted fully back toward the man who had caged her for years with promises, threats, and luxury. The timing of this shift was almost cruel, because Nikki had recently stood tall and delivered a blistering ultimatum to Victor, threatening to leave him if he continued his obsessive need to destroy Jack and Jabot. It had been one of Nikki's bravest moments, a reminder that she was not merely an accessory to Victor's empire but a woman with self-respect and boundaries. Fans applauded her spine, her fire, the clarity of her refusal to be dragged into another Newman Abbott war. And yet, only days later, Victor placed a glittering necklace around her neck, a piece of jewelry so spectacular, so dazzling, that it seemed specifically designed to blur the lines between apology and ownership. Suddenly, Nikki's resolve began to wobble, and people wondered whether the woman who had stared down alcoholism, kidnappings, abuse, and the darkest corners of her own past had really been undone by a few shimmering diamonds. The question was painful because it struck at the heart of Nikki's identity. Was she truly so shallow that a luxury gift could outweigh her conscience? Or was something deeper, something far more complex, clawing at her from within? The truth was that Victor Newman had always known the language of Nikki's insecurities better than anyone. His gifts were never simply gifts, they were anchors, symbols of safety, reminders of a life filled with prestige and protection. Each jewel he placed around her neck came with an unspoken message: with me, you are unbreakable. Without me, you are alone. And after decades of being pulled into his gravitational field, Nikki had learned to associate his extravagance with stability. It wasn't that she valued diamonds over integrity, it was that Victor's presence, for all its toxicity, was one of the few constants in a life defined by turbulence. Jack offered her compassion, understanding, truth, but Victor offered her certainty. And certainty, for someone who had battled addiction, insecurity, and emotional fragility, was a powerful drug. Still, the optics were damning. Nikki's sudden shift made her appear like a woman who had sold out a lifelong friend for a necklace, a bracelet, a shiny promise. It raised questions that Genoa City whispered behind manicured hands. Was Nikki really that easily swayed? Had decades of character growth been erased by one grand gesture? Was she about to become Victor's weapon? According to Griffith, the consequences of Nikki's new loyalty would be devastating for Jack and Diane, because both Victor and Nikki would be involved in actions designed specifically to bring Jack down. For Diane, who had clawed her way back from infamy and rebuilt her life brick by brick, the idea of Nikki helping Victor target her husband was a nightmare she had not anticipated. And for Jack, who had clung to the belief that Nikki was a moral counterweight to Victor's cruelty, the betrayal cut deeper than any corporate attack. But beneath the surface of scandal and speculation, a more uncomfortable truth was emerging on that Nikki herself was struggling to confront. She had been living in a world of fractures, torn between her belief in Jack's integrity and her instinctive loyalty to Victor, a man she had loved, feared, and relied upon for most of her adult life. Her ultimatum had been genuine. Her frustration with Victor's obsession had been real. But in the end, something inside her had cracked. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of always resisting Victor's storms. Perhaps it was the emotional vulnerability of her recent struggles. Perhaps it was simply easier to return to the familiar rhythms of Newman loyalty than to stand against a force as unstoppable as Victor Newman. Because opposing Victor meant isolation, instability, and danger, while siding with him meant protection, even if that protection came draped in moral compromise. And so Nikki hovered on the edge of a transformation that could alter the alliances of Genoa City for years to come. She was no longer the woman offering gentle guidance to an enraged Victor, nor the friend offering comfort to Jack when Victor crossed another line. She was becoming the tipping point, the catalyst, the hidden dagger disguised beneath elegance and pearls. Whether she realized it or not, her decision to stand with Victor, regardless of whether it was driven by love, fear, or fatigue, made her the most unpredictable player on the board. If Nikki truly chose Victor's side, it would not merely be a betrayal. It would be a declaration, a statement that identity, history, and survival mattered more than moral righteousness. A statement that she had finally accepted who she was when stripped of pretense a Newman. And for Jack Abbott, who had always trusted the version of Nikki that existed outside Victor's influence, that revelation would be the deepest wound of all. Jack Abbott had weathered decades of betrayal, corporate sabotage, blackmail, and heartbreak. But nothing struck him with quite the same force as the creeping realization that Nikki knew one person he believed could still rise above Victor's gravitational pull might now be slipping away from him entirely. He felt the shift before it was ever spoken aloud, an almost imperceptible cooling in her tone, a hesitation in her defenses, a softening every time Victor's name came up. As though the fire she once used to confront her husband was dimming into a faint, flickering ember. With every rumor swirling through Genoa City and every leaked hint from the production team, the narrative was becoming clearer. Nikki was no longer standing between Jack and Victor's war. She was crossing the line. And the question that weighed hardest on Jack was not how she had changed, but why. How had Victor managed, after so many years of cruelty and manipulation, to twist Nikki back into a position of unwavering loyalty? Had she simply surrendered? Had the man who treated her as both queen and captive finally broken through her resistance with glittering promises and emotional pressure? Jack wanted to believe that Nikki was stronger than that she could not be bought, not with diamonds, not with nostalgia, and certainly not with Victor's grandiose theatrics. Yet the timing of her transformation was troubling, almost too convenient, as if orchestrated with the precision of one of Victor's most ruthless chess moves. Whispers in Genoa City painted Nikki as being mesmerized, enchanted, even submissive, as though Victor had reasserted control over her mind as much as her marriage. Some described her as a loyal dog on a diamond leash, an accusation so harsh that even Jack winced when he heard it, because it suggested a level of weakness he never wanted to attribute to her. And yet, something was undeniably wrong. The woman who once threatened to walk out on Victor for the sake of honesty and fairness now seemed to be falling in line without resistance. Even Michael Baldwin, who had played his own share of morally ambiguous games to survive Victor's orbit, never sunk so quickly into the role of obedient follower. Michael questioned him. Michael pushed back. But Nikki, she was beginning to follow Victor's lead with a quiet, unsettling obedience that made even Victor's enemies stop and recalibrate their strategies. It was as though she had been swallowed whole by the Newman machine. Jack couldn't shake the idea that something deeper lurked beneath the surface, something more sinister than simple persuasion. Victor Newman had always been a master manipulator, capable of bending truth, emotion, and even memory into whatever shape suited his mission. What if he had found a new way to pressure Nikki, leveraging an insecurity, a secret, or a past mistake she couldn't risk being exposed? What if Nikki's sudden loyalty was not willing at all, but coerced? The possibility of a hidden plot began to take root in Jack's mind, growing like a splinter he couldn't remove. After all, Nikki had lived through addiction, trauma, and psychological battles that left scars Victor knew how to press. And the more Jack examined her recent behavior, the more it felt rehearsed, almost as if she were performing loyalty rather than living it. Could she be setting a trap so elaborate, so dangerous, that not even Victor suspected it? Genoa City had seen Nikki play double agent before, quietly collecting information, nudging the right dominoes, allowing Victor's enemies to underestimate her. But never had she played this deeply into Victor's hands. Never had she aligned herself so publicly with his vendetta. So the question began to echo across town. Was Nikki betraying Jack, or was she trying to save him? Was her sudden shift a sign of surrender, or the opening move in a trap designed to bring Victor's entire scheme crashing down? And if it was a trap, how long could she dance on the blade of that sword before one wrong step cut her open? Jack knew better than anyone that trusting Nikki blindly could be dangerous, but abandoning faith in her entirely would be worse. The emotional bond between them, forged through decades of loss and healing, made him hesitate to condemn her outright. Every time he tried to imagine Nikki deliberately participating in an attack against him and Diane, something inside him refused to believe it. Nikki had her flaws, could be impulsive, proud, easily swayed by emotion, but betrayal for betrayal's sake had never been her nature. She was not malicious. She was not calculating. If she was working against Jack, there had to be a reason either for survival or for strategy. Yet the evidence mounting around her was impossible to ignore. She was moving differently, speaking differently, acting as though Jack's friendship carried a weight she no longer wanted to hold. Victor's presence seemed to envelop her again, suffocating the independence she had fought to reclaim. And now Griffith's revelation that Nikki had sworn loyalty to Victor, fully embracing his mission to bring Jack down, threatened to shatter the last sliver of hope Jack had managed to preserve. The consequences, Griffith warned, would be massively devastating, even suggesting that whatever Victor and Nikki were planning would strike at the very foundation of Jack and Diane's stability. Jack felt the dread settle into his bones. The betrayal, if it was betrayal, was not about business. It was personal, intimate. It struck at the heart of trust he had held for Nikki for decades. And yet, buried beneath the hurt, a dangerous thought flickered. What if Nikki wasn't betraying him at all, but playing a long game? What if she was infiltrating Victor's scheme only to destabilize it from the inside, sacrificing her reputation to protect Jack in a way no one saw coming? Nikki was capable of stunning acts of bravery and self-destruction in equal measure. Her history made her impossible to predict. And so the town found itself trapped between two opposing interpretations: Nikki the traitor, or Nikki the strategist. Nikki the coward, or Nikki the double agent. Nikki the loyal Newman, or Nikki the undercover Abbott ally. The truth, when it arrived, would reshape everything. But until then, Genoa City waited, breathless, divided, and electrified by the same burning question. Had Nikki Newman truly turned her back on Jack Abbott? Or was she orchestrating one of the most intricate gambits the show had ever seen? And if this was a trap, if Nikki was preparing the most spectacular reversal of all time, then Victor, Jack, and Diane were all marching toward a reckoning none of them were prepared for.